Welcome to another emission of GLOBEDADES. This is a podcast of the Faculty of Global Studies at Anáhuac University in Mexico. My name is Arturo Flores, and today we are going to talk about a very interesting topic. We're going to talk about uh, collaboration opportunities between Australia and Mexico. And I have a very special guest today. She is Barbara Klopenhouwer, and she's counselor of the Australian Embassy in Mexico City in the topics of education and research. Barbara, how are you this morning?
I'm well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be able to join you remotely at the Anáhuac campus.
Great to have you. Just to give a background of how we met a couple of weeks ago in a very interesting international conference held at Anáhuac University, and we sat on the same table and we were talking about all these different perspectives that people might have about the relationship between Australia and Mexico. And one of the things that we talked about was how similar in many ways both countries are. So, Barbara, my first question will go in that sense. Like, what are some of the similarities that you find between Mexico and Australia?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, like many Australians, I didn't necessarily have a really deep knowledge of Mexico before I moved here. But before I started the role in Mexico City in 2021, I knew that Mexico and Australia had a shared history in terms of Indigenous culture and a long-standing connection of its peoples to its land. So I knew that that was one point in commonality between both countries. I was also aware, of course, that we work together internationally, not just bilaterally, but in fora, for example, like OECD or G20, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. So more than people might expect, Mexico and Australia share that active participation on the global stage in some of these key fora. But a lot of these things are, in some senses, academic before you move to a country. And so when I finally made it here in August of that year, I was really surprised at how much I felt at home almost immediately. And I'd never been to Mexico before. The first time I came was to move here. So it was a bit of a leap into the unknown, but it was such a pleasant surprise that, of course, we have a language difference, and that can be a bit of a barrier, but culturally, the similarities really, really surprised me. And by that, I mean that shared sense of warmth and hospitality really reminded me of being back in Australia. People are really open. People will chat to you when you're in the cafe or greet you when you're in the elevator. Touches like that really make you feel connected very quickly. But also things like appreciation for good food, for good drinks, for good times, and that appreciation for life.
The party side as well.
Exactly. I remember when I moved, people said, "Oh, be careful, people drink a lot in Mexico." And I was like, in Australia, they enjoy one too. So
Yeah.
that's not too much of a culture shock. But I really think one of the pieces of feedback we've had from a lot of former students who were in Australia is they felt the same way when they arrived in Australia. It was a bit unknown. They weren't sure what to expect. And they were pleasantly surprised at how much it reminded them of Mexico, albeit very different country. Some of these traits are definitely shared between both. And so that's been wonderful to see it firsthand.
Yeah, as you say, well, I think we are far away in terms of the distance between Mexico and Australia, but in many ways, I think we share, as you were saying, culture, values, and several things which we don't perhaps realize because we do not like interact with Australians on a daily basis. But myself, I had very good experiences with Australian people when I was doing my master's and my PhD. I remember, that the warmth that you were saying is like the first thing that you identify Australians. This guy is from Australia because they're very open and friendly, and they immediately talk to you and want to know about you. Which is something that we do the same here in Mexico. We try to be open people and friendly people.
Yes. Yes, and that shared values point is really important as well. I think that is an important sense of connection when you can see that there are shared values, whether it's both being democracies, whether it's the way that we sort of live together and have that openness to new experiences and new people, that those things are very important.
Yeah. And going more to your activities here in Mexico as part of the embassy, which are the main activities that you do as the counselor on education and research?
So the Counsellor for Education and Research role is quite interesting because it is not attached to the equivalent Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Australia. It is actually a policy position that is attached to the Australian Federal Department of Education. Wow. So our Department of Education in Australia has domestic responsibilities across education from early childhood through to higher education. But they also have a dedicated international division, which is quite interesting, that does a whole range of work from protecting students in Australia, international student regulation to make sure that students in Australia have a quality experience. But they also have an outward-looking role in terms of relationships, policy dialogue, cooperation on best practices globally to share our perspectives with partners, but also to learn from partners and to bring that back into Australia's education system, which is quite internationalised by global standards. So our department has a network overseas. It is a relatively small network. Most of the positions have historically been in Asia. So from Indonesia, our immediate neighbour, all the way up through to China and Japan in the north part of the Asian region. And in 2014, we opened an office in Brazil to expand our connections over in Latin America. And in 2018, we opened this office here in Mexico City, which is the newest anywhere in the network. And that expansion in Brazil and Mexico reflected the fact that we were seeing more organic activity happening between the region and Australia. We were seeing more students coming. We were seeing more interest in university partnerships. We were seeing more research collaboration. And while it was fantastic to see that beginning to develop, it can hit barriers without that government support. And by barriers, I mean issues like perhaps qualifications recognition or not understanding how the two systems speak to each other. So, for example, vocational education and training in Australia has different names across Latin America around técnico profesional or other terminology, other approaches to qualifications and key components of education systems. And those things can inhibit deeper partnerships. And so the role of the Department of Education is to be specialist when it comes to education systems and policies and to work with our partners, government to government. So here in Mexico, for example, we have a memorandum of understanding with CEP and CONACYT, which has similar national responsibilities to our department. But we also work with the sector, we call it, so the university sector as a whole. So we might not necessarily work in great depth with individual institutions, but we'll work with associations, with peak bodies on promoting best practices, exchange on emerging issues in education policy. A good recent example is micro-credentials, which is growing in importance as people look at continuous learning and lifelong learning. But the job is very diverse in terms of what do I actually do, which is a good question. And every day is very different because you have these broad objectives of of breaking down barriers and opening opportunities for partnerships, for mobility in both directions. But every day is different because you're working with people. So some days you're focused on a very technical aspect of the education system and having dialogue. The next day you're implementing a project and making sure it's on budget and meeting its milestones. Other days you might be representing Australia, so speaking at an event or having that representational role. So it's very diverse, but that focus is very much on collaboration from a policy sense and that shared priority of quality education and research with international relevance that benefits relationships such as Australia and Mexico's.
That's very, very interesting. Just a reminder to the people who are watching and listening to this podcast today. We are talking with Barbara Klopenhouwer, who is counselor on education and research at the Australian Embassy in Mexico City. This is GLOBEDADES, a podcast of the Faculty of Global Studies at Anáhuac University, and my name is Arturo Flores. So it's really interesting what you're saying about the partnership possibilities. So could you share some examples that you have like initiated or participated that have taken place between Mexico and Australia currently? Like, give us just to have a perspective of the things that more operationally you do.
Mm-hmm. Well, perhaps the event that you mentioned where we met recently is a good example of creating opportunities for partnerships. One of the barriers or the challenges that we try to tackle in our work is that lack of historic familiarity. As we were speaking about earlier, once people have connected between Australia and Mexico, my experience is they're very effective relationships. People are almost like, oh, I wish I'd known earlier, you know, but that first step, how you get past the lack of familiarity, is often the hardest bit. So a lot of our work on partnerships is creating opportunities to bring people together, because it's people who make up institutions and it's people who drive partnerships. And so the Mexican International Education Association, AMPE, is obviously a great connector of people here in Mexico who work in international higher education, but also with international partners. And so I remember speaking early on in my time here in Mexico with the AMPE president and talking about there is this challenge of we don't really know where to start in building deeper engagement. And so the AMPE National Conference was a fantastic opportunity to, I guess, share with everybody here in Mexico's international higher education system that Australia is really open, but also really interested and proactively looking to build deeper partnerships. And so we were the invited country of honour this year at the event held at Anáhuac University, which is the first time we've worked with AMPE in this way. Yeah. And it was a great chance for a number of Australian academics, researchers, international office staff to come here to Mexico and to meet with a really broad range of faculties and institutions, and to look quite specifically at opportunities for collaboration. And because it is relatively early, there's an exciting opportunity to really shape what both sides want to see from partnerships. And by that, I mean finding areas that are really relevant to Mexican and Australian societies and economies, where there's relevant expertise on both sides and really tangible benefits from collaboration. And so to give you two practical examples, we had Charles Sturt University, which comes from a regional part of New South Wales, a town called Wagga Wagga, and some surrounding small towns. So not the most famous cities that people think of when they think of Australia, but they have a specialist agriculture institute that also has particular expertise in winemaking, and really internationally recognized skill. And so we help to connect them here in Mexico with some key stakeholders in Baja California in particular, and the Wine Research Center that has recently been established there and looking to build its international partnerships. And they were able to come and visit after almost a year of online engagement after introduction, they were able to come and visit and spend time in Baja to visit not only the university, but also local winemakers to deepen their understanding of the industry here and its specific needs and challenges, and the role education and research could help play in meeting those needs. And then they came to the AMPE conference, where they were also able to connect with other stakeholders, for example, in Guanajuato, which is also a very important wine. So that's one quite tangible example with some really exciting opportunities for winemaking processes, for business development here in Mexico, but also Australia, because there are different seasons. Mexico's in the northern hemisphere, Australia's in the southern hemisphere. So even the grape production cycle, both sides can benefit by sending students and academics to benefit from these time differences or seasonal differences as one example of why working together can open new opportunities that alone an institution may not be able to benefit from. And my other very quick example would be the University of Sydney and its Faculty of Engineering, which has actually established an Ausmex circular economy hub in Monterey, which is fascinating, focused on that very important topic of circular economy and how we move to a more sustainable footing in the way we use resources. And they're working in Monterey with local government stakeholders, with local universities, with industry, doing things like masterclasses there, but also research collaboration. And they're looking to expand that network or node with other partnerships here in Mexico. And so they were able to attend that conference and meet with stakeholders from Guadalajara, from all over the country, to talk about the ways that they could practically start to connect academics and researchers with relevant stakeholders in different parts of Mexico. So very exciting, but lots of diversity in the types of activities and the topics.
Yeah, and I was really impressed by the large number of Australian universities who came to this conference, because it's not near, and there were quite a few. And as you said, I think all these examples provide a very interesting vision of what the type of partnerships that academia, research, and the fact that you are sort of an independent office, like doing or specialized on education, that makes it a very interesting case. The fact that the Australian government has thought about developing this international office for education. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's a fascinating job because, as I mentioned, every day is so different. And one day you're talking about wine, the next day you're looking at, water management, which comes up quite regularly, because for Mexico and Australia, that is a really profound challenge that both countries have to navigate. And so again, that exchange, the partnerships, the collaboration is what is going to be essential if we are going to manage some of these biggest challenges of our time.
Okay. Yeah. That's all. I guess it's part of a long-term relationship between different actors and developing new models and new things of how to do these collaborations, between both countries. This is a reminder to everyone who is watching and listening to this podcast today. We are talking to Barbara Klopenhouwer. She's counselor on education and research from the Australian Embassy in Mexico. This is GLOBEDADES. My name is Arturo Flores, a podcast from the Faculty of Global Studies at Anáhuac University. So, what will be some recommendations that you can give to people who would like to go to Australia or learn about Australia or study in Australia? What would they have to do, or what would you recommend them to do?
Well, Australia has a fairly large website called Study Australia, which is the sort of first port of call for information around the Australian education system, specific institutions, opportunities for study. And interestingly, some of my colleagues here at the embassy who come from an organisation called Austrade, the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, they have responsibility for promoting Australia internationally. It might be promoting Australian international education, promoting our agricultural exports, a whole range of sectors. And so as part of their work to promote Australia and to share information, they've actually created a specific sub-website called the Study Australia Experience, which is specifically for the Latin American region and available in Spanish and Portuguese. So that's quite interesting to look at as well, because it's speaking directly to people in countries such as Mexico, to try and help answer very practical questions around, how would I get a visa, or all sorts of things around which programs are there and where should I look if I'm interested in studying this or undertaking this type of program. So I always recommend having a look there first. It's a good point to start with, particularly if you're not quite sure, I'm thinking of Australia, where do I start? And then having a look. There are, of course, also quite regular events that, again, our Austrade colleagues attend in terms of student fairs and international events here in Mexico City, but also other cities like Guadalajara and Monterrey. But not everybody is in a major city. So I think that's why it's important there are these online opportunities to connect and ask questions and to access information. So I think that's a good starting point. Often we find that, and it's growing slowly, that networks of people as well, where there have been a lot of others who have studied in Australia. People go, oh, my cousin, or I had a friend, I think they went there, maybe I'll have a talk with them and learn more about their experience. And I think one of the challenges we've had is that in Mexico, it's perhaps not as common compared to, say, Brazil or Colombia, where there have been a lot of students, thousands and thousands of students over the years who have undertaken a study experience in Australia and come back and can share those experiences and insights with their friends and family. In Mexico, it's growing, but we are very mindful that might not be as easy. And so we've also, around the embassy, developed billboards with stories from Mexicans who have been in Australia, undertaken study or research, how they found it. And we also have a series of videos that are available on the embassy's social media, its Facebook page, where we have people talking about how they ended up in Australia, how they found it, what kind of impact it's made for them personally and also professionally. And most of those people are back in Mexico making a really important difference here. And that's the beauty, I think, of international engagement, is that you can move and have experiences and bring those back and benefit, the place that you maybe originally came from.
Yeah, because I think here maybe we have the perception, generally speaking, that the normal or the market to go to if you want to study abroad, maybe you look up north always, like to the US.
Yes.
And here we are looking at another opportunity, another different, everything is different. So which could be a very, very interesting experience in many ways. So
and I think I very much agree, and it's natural, of course, that you look close to home in the first instance, and I think there's that leap into maybe what feels a bit more unknown with Australia. But I also think sometimes there's a perception that maybe if I go, I have to do a full qualification, or it's going to be expensive, or I'm not sure how it will benefit my career development. And one thing that surprises a lot of people is that Australia, for example, is a very popular English destination. So many people in South America might have finished their university studies. They have qualifications, but they're not necessarily super confident in their English, or they feel they need to improve it before they enter the workforce. And so they think, well, actually, I can go to Australia, I can work while I'm studying English, and I can have a cultural experience where I'm immersed in English. It's something different. It will give me an enriching experience and perspective that I can bring back and apply once I'm working back in my home country. So even looking at the different types, it's not only that you must go and do a full degree or a master's. In fact, there's a lot of really interesting ways to go and have that education and cultural experience and to bring those skills back.
Well, Barbara, I want to thank you very much for your time. It has been a pleasure talking to you. And I hope it's not the last time that we speak in this podcast about possibilities of collaboration between Australia and Mexico. Thank you very much, Barbara. And well, this is GLOBEDADES, a podcast from the Faculty of Global Studies at Anáhuac University, Mexico. My name is Arturo Flores. Thank you all for listening today. Bye.